Okay, so for Bible study today, we are still in the historical books, the section of our Old Testament survey, and today we have a special treat. Um, we're going to look at the cycles of leadership in the Old Testament, and you're not going to see this anywhere else that I know of. This was some observations, uh, patterns that I saw when I was doing my dissertation. And what I found, my dissertation was looking at the violence in the Old Testament by individuals. So, not trying to examine every kind of violence, not looking at armies, attacking armies, not looking at God being violent, but looking at individuals and kind of looking for a pattern in their violence with the idea that we can look at the violence of people in the Old Testament and get a good idea about their faith in God. And so if they use their violence to protect the weak, to protect females, protect children, protect animals, then that is a clue to us reading that they love God. Then the authors intentionally used the violence as a way of kind of revealing their faith. And on the other hand, when people are act out violently, maybe assassinate somebody in order to get their stuff or their position, we know that those people don't love God. And what I found was it was very consistent, that pattern, and it kind of revealed an ethic of why people use violence in the Bible. Now, what I found as I looked at it is that the violence by individuals, really all violence in the Bible, has to do with leadership. It's always connected with leadership. Very little violence by private citizens. Um, it almost always has to do with, uh, well, it's connected to the leaders. And so as I went through, I saw a pattern, a repeating pattern of leadership in the Old Testament. Now, did you get a sheet? I made a sheet. It's right here. There, you have one. Pass that around. Okay, just to kind of guide your notes, and you can see the pattern there. So this is cycles of leadership in the Old Testament, and there was a famous German uh, scholar describing the role of a king in the ancient world, and he said, "A king must do war." When we think about kingship, we we tend to think of riding around in a chariot with a crown, those kind of things. But in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, a king was much closer to a general. Most of you lived when Ike was president, and that was an example. Let's see, I think that was the last time, wasn't it, that we had a general that we made the president. And so in America, we've kind of gone away from that idea. In the ancient world, that would have been the norm. They would have said, of course, Ike was the top. I guess Marshall was the top ranking general in World War II. Um, Eisenhower was the highest ranking active general, and we made him the leader of our country. And that's a very ancient way of thinking about it. So in the ancient world, kings were generals, and not just a general that stood in back in a tent giving orders, though they did that too. Often you would find a king out in front, out in the front line, cracking heads together. Alexander the Great was a great warrior, for example. And so let me show you this pattern that I observed of leadership. I think there's big movements in the Bible with its repeating pattern, and I think you can kind of see the flow of the Old Testament. It's kind of an almost an overview of the Old Testament through these cycles of leadership. And so the pattern goes like this. It will start out giving an introduction of the leader. And we'll see in the next slide, we'll look at examples. We'll use the example of Abraham. But for now, the introduction of the leader. So there's an introduction story. And then immediately, or very soon after introducing a leader, we get a warning story really about human nature, about the sin nature. But there is a story about these ancient Hebrew leaders that said, be careful, watch out. There's something not 100% correct. Now that one aspect there, the number 2 in the pattern, the warning story, is very uniquely Hebrew. Most outside of the Bible, most of the stuff we have from the ancient world is very positive about kings. In fact, most of the writing makes the kings superhuman and super beneficent people. And that is because in the ancient world, it was expensive to write things down. That was cutting edge technology. And only kings could afford to hire people to write stuff. And of course, when you are hiring somebody to write something about your kingship, do you hire somebody that writes warnings about your character? No. And so a lot of things that we have are on stelas, and that's a big column of rock where they have chipped in, writing and telling us about it. And so we have these stelas, and often they'll fight a battle, and history has told us that they lost the battle badly. But on the stela, it'll say, I won a great victory. I crushed my enemies. And so a warning story about the character of the leader is uniquely Hebrew. Now, why in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, why would they give us warnings about the leaders? And we know this. How many perfect men were in the Old Testament? 0. That's right. Romans 3:23, Paul said, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And so that concept of sin is a Hebrew concept inspired by God. So God gives them a warning, gives us a warning that these people are sinful too. Even old David, we just talked about David. Was David sinful too? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Most of us are not going to do near as bad of things as David did. So there is a warning story about their human nature. Then the third in the pattern, and this is kind of surprising in people that you don't think about being military, but it's military legitimacy, however you want to put that, of the leader. That they are legitimate, capable of fighting, establishing them as a fighter. So I say military legitimacy of the leader is the third step. And you may not have noticed it, but people you did not think of as military leaders, I believe the author goes out of his way to establish them as military leaders. Then once they are established as a military leader, then God makes a covenant with them. And so I've told you many times that we have found peace treaties, especially from the Hittite Empire, which was in Turkey. And when they had conquered northern Israel, what's in Syria now, especially the city of Ugarit, we found a lot of tablets and we found a peace treaty. The Hittite king, Hatsuli III, made a peace treaty with the king of Ugarit, which is a city on the coast in Syria. And it was a peace treaty. And what we found is, as we studied the structure of that peace treaty, that it was the same structure that the covenants were. When God made covenants with Abraham, Moses, David, that they were structured like these Hittite peace treaties. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that's a standard way in the ancient world of making an agreement. We would say a covenant, but making a treaty with somebody. And so I very much, because of that, when I think of covenant, I think of a peace treaty. So when God made a peace treaty with Abraham, it makes a lot of sense. What is the wage of sin? What's the consequence of sin ultimately? The wage of sin is death, what Paul said, Romans 6:23. Same thing in the ancient world. And that's the thing, as you study the Old Testament, they really take sin serious. God takes sin very serious. In the Old Testament, sin is treated like an armed rebellion against the king. We call that treason. You think about Cain. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Numbers 35:33. Atonement cannot be made for blood spilt on the land except by the blood of him who shed it. And so man is guilty of treason against God that carries a death penalty. And what did God do with these leaders? He made a peace treaty. Now, when Hatsuli III made his peace treaty with the Ugaritic king, he gave him land as part of the agreement, as a stipulation. And kings had the right to give land. And that's important. You know, when we went through the conquest, part of the thing there was that in the eyes of the Hebrews, God was the king and he could give them that land because it belonged to him. Well, what's the significance of land as part of a treaty? It said, as long as this land I give you exists, may we be at peace. It's a sense of permanence. What is more permanent than land? And that's what God did in his peace treaty with the Israelites, is he gave them land, a land to dwell in. And as long as the land of Israel exists, we're going to be at peace. Or at least from my end, we should say, at least from God's end, there's going to be at peace. Now, has the land of Israel been significant in the history of the relationship between Israel and God? Well, absolutely. No other ancient people have maintained a relationship with a deity and as stipulated by a land grant thousands and thousands of years ago. So there is a covenant. Now, who do you make a peace treaty with? The military leader. And so it's logical that they establish them in step 3 as a military leader. Once they are a military leader, then God will make a peace treaty with them. After the peace treaty, step 5, there is a disintegrating leadership and failure. It happens over and over, where once there's a covenant, then that leader, the leadership falls apart. Again, why? Well, because we're sinful. 2 things. We're sinful, and the leaders are sinful. And even if we're pretty good, we get old, and we're unable to lead. If leadership is connected to our ability to do violence, can y'all fight as good as you could 40 years ago? No, we all lose the ability to fight. And so if being a general, being able to fight is a core. Now I know this is offensive to some people. I'm just telling you what my observations of the Bible, not the way that things necessarily should be. The Israelites lived in a violent world. And if you did not have the ability to fight, you were killed and enslaved. Men were killed, women, young women, childbearing age, women were taken as slaves, children were taken as slaves, the men and the old people were killed. That's the world they lived in. And so people in America who can call the police if their neighbor is turning the music up too loud have the luxury to criticize the way ancient people selected their leaders and the relationship of that and what they prayed about. So that's fine. If you don't like it, that's fine. You don't live in the ancient Near East, and so you don't understand. So anyway, but it is significant that step 5, that leadership began to fail after God made a peace treaty with them. We want it to be the other way, but that's the reality in the Bible. And then finally, a very interesting thing, step 6, a leader follows that failed leadership. So the leadership failed, and then it's as if God sends another man to follow who faithfully obeys Yahweh God. A leader follows who faithfully obeys Yahweh God, who is good. We would say who is good. So as leadership disintegrates, then a good man who listens to God comes next. And this leader in step 6 is often a little bit mysterious. We don't know as much about these followers generally as we do about the people that fail. And so far you have to take my word for it. Now let me show you some examples. The examples of the patterns, and then we'll look at the big divisions, the big cycles that I see in the Bible. So the introduction in Genesis chapter 12 was for Abraham. So step 1 is an introduction of the leader. Genesis 12 introduced Abraham. He was Abram originally, and then later his name was changed to Abraham. Abram is like something to the nature of exalted father. I think literally father of standing. And then Abraham is much more leader of nations, leader of peoples. And so Abram is kind of focused inward on Abraham, exalted father, and Abraham focuses out on his mission. Then there's a warning story. Immediately, it is so funny, immediately after God calls Abraham, he says, in you I will bless the whole world. I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. In you I will bless the whole world. And then immediately there's a famine, and Abram has the great idea to go down to Egypt. He gets down there, he gets scared, and he gives his wife Sarah into Pharaoh's harem.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
I hope everything goes well. No, I'm glad you did.
You'll have to go back.
Okay. Well, you know I like to repeat myself.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye. And so immediately he does a weird thing. No time in history, no peoples have thought it's okay to give your wife into a Pharaoh's harem. And he does it out of fear. And so as soon as God gives the promise, God has not made a covenant with Abraham yet, but he has made a promise to give him the land. And he says, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to bless other people. Immediately we're given a story of weak character in Abraham, the potential for weak character. Well, we go to chapter 14, and there is an odd story where 4 kings from the east come and wage war, from Mesopotamia come and wage war with 5 kings in the area of what will become Israel in the Promised Land, and they defeat them soundly. The First World War, you might say, in chapter 14. And at the end of it, they capture Sodom and Gomorrah, and they capture Lot, who is Abram's nephew. Lot takes 308 trained men from his household, and he goes most likely and attacks the rear guard as those kings are headed back to Mesopotamia. He attacks their baggage train. He recaptures the prisoners, including Lot, and he captures the booty. And as he's going back, he gives a tenth of his military booty, a tenth of it to Melchizedek. And so in chapter 14, Abram is established as a military leader, one who can lead a military action. And then what do you know, in the very next chapter, God makes a covenant with him. And there are 2 chapters that do the covenant, chapter 15 and chapter 17. But isn't it interesting that God calls Abraham in chapter 12 but does not make a covenant with him? Only after he goes and does a military action. So we know that he's a military guy. Does God make a peace treaty with him? Well, so Abraham does pretty good, actually. In his cycle, his sons get progressively worse. So Abraham is the high water mark for the Abrahamic cycle, but Isaac is not quite as good or dependable as Abraham. Isaac tries to favor the son that is not picked by God. And then we get to Jacob, and Jacob is a train wreck. There is nothing in Jacob's actions that I think that I would call godly. Now he does say several times some correct things, but when it comes to actions, his actions are generally bad and selfish and self-centered. And when he is questioned by Pharaoh at the end of Genesis, this is Jacob, he says, "Few and evil have been my days." So the leadership disintegrates after Abraham. And then what do you know? After Jacob, a leader comes who faithfully obeys God, and his name is Joseph. And he is, just about everything we learn about him is good. The next cycle is Moses, where he's introduced. Immediately we're given a warning story. He gets emotional and attacks and kills an Egyptian from behind. That story, it warns us of a weakness in Moses, but it also establishes him as a man who can do violence. And then after that, God makes a covenant with Moses at Sinai. Every story after Mount Sinai, Moses is weak and vacillating. Everybody turns against Moses, the people, even his brother and sister question his leadership. And then after him comes a leader who faithfully obeys, and he is Joshua. So let's look at the cycles. Cycle 1 I would call the Abrahamic cycle. Abraham and his sons in the book of Genesis. And then the second cycle I would call the Mosaic cycle, and it's Exodus through Deuteronomy. Then the third cycle in the Old Testament would be the monarchy. And again, the introduction to the monarchy is Saul. Saul does give us Saul's whole story is a warning story, but there's also warnings against David. But they both are military men, military legitimacy. God makes a peace treaty with David, a covenant, and then after the covenant, David goes downhill, as we've seen recently. Bathsheba, he goes out and tries to do war. They say, "You're too old, you can't fight anymore." And after that, if you look at the decisions he makes, the stuff he says to Solomon he gets a little bit peevish, and he asks Solomon to get retribution on some of his enemies and stuff like that. It's kind of weak. And then after David, the monarchy falls to pieces, and it disintegrates down to the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrian captivity for northern kingdom of Israel, 150 later, 586 BC, the Babylonian captivity. The Hebrew Bible ends with 2 Chronicles, and at the end of 2 Chronicles, Jeconiah gets let out of prison after 37 years. And so there is just a spark of hope at the end of 2 Chronicles that the Davidic line has survived. But that is the end of the pattern there. And so if in fact this is a true pattern, which I've demonstrated it in the text, the pattern is not completed in that third cycle. There's a big hole. We are expecting the one to come later who will obey God. But he hasn't come yet. At the end of the Hebrew Bible, there is a gap in the cycle, and we're waiting for completion for that cycle. Now, in between the second and third cycle, the Mosaic cycle and the monarchy, and so you see the first two cycles we would say are prophetic. God speaks to Abraham, then he leads. God speaks to Moses, then he leads. When we get down to the monarchy, we are going to a secular government. God is not speaking. If God if God needs, after David, God's not speaking so much directly to, and that is kind of the contrast between Saul and David. Saul doesn't have a relationship with God, and so he has to have Samuel tell him. Then we have David, who does talk directly to God, generally. Then after him, the prophets are necessary to communicate with the kings. They disintegrate. So we would say secular leadership in the third cycle. The first two are prophetic, God-led cycles. The transition between the second and third cycles would be the book of Judges. And we know a judge is a hybrid leader. He is prophet, he is priest, and he is military general. And so, very interestingly, right in the middle of the word Judges is the letter G, and that G stands for Gideon, who stands right in the middle of the book of Judges. And what do we know about Gideon's early life, or when he was first called? He reminds us a lot of Moses, doesn't he? And he leads like Moses, and great victories. God delivers the people, and they win a great victory over Midian. And then later, he begins to act more like Saul, and more like the monarchy. He is not talking to God. He is waging war on people. And so what I would say is that Judges is the hinge that connects the prophetic phase of leadership, where people are directed by God, with the secular. And Gideon is the pivot point right in the middle of the Old Testament that kind of shows us the flow. I mean, to me, these cycles kind of demonstrate the flow of the whole Old Testament, and it's not a good trend. And Gideon stands right there in the middle. So after the third cycle, as I said, 2 Chronicles, there's a big hole, and we are waiting expectantly. And it reminds me of Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, where God promised Moses is not going to be there forever. He said, I'll raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I'll put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. And so at the end of the Hebrew Bible, we're waiting expectantly for that prophet to come. And I believe most of us know the rest of the story. He came about almost 600 years after the end of the cycle, and his name was Jesus. And he was in some ways a mysterious figure, but he did right, and he obeyed everything that God commanded him. That is the cycle of leadership. And so we're going to cut it a little bit short today, and let's go ahead and say a prayer and be dismissed.